Welcome back. Christian Whiton is our guest. He is a principal these days at DC International Advisory, LLC. He formerly served in senior capacities in the U.S. State Department under George W. Bush. Also, as a campaign advisor to Newt Gingrich back in the last election cycle. He's the author, among other things, of Smart Power, Between Diplomacy and War. You will often find him at Fox News and elsewhere, contributing mightily to the public understanding of the major issues, particularly in the foreign policy arena of our time, and we're always delighted when he does it here at Secure Freedom Radio. Christian, welcome back. Good to have you.
Great to be here, Frank. Thanks.
Let's start with your thoughts on this Iran deal. I guess by virtue of having spent time in Foggy Bottom, as they call it, appropriately enough, just be interested in kind of your thoughts on the tradecraft of John Kerry and Wendy Sherman and their ilk as they negotiated this seemingly disastrous deal with the Iranians.
Well, it brings to mind something a Foreign Service officer, of all people, said while I was at state in regard to what we did with North Korea at the time, which was calling it, quote, preemptive capitulation. And it's very interesting. There's something in this that's very reminiscent to me because I was working on North Korean human rights issues. We were looking for a way to make life a little more difficult for the Kim regime when Chris Hill and Condi Rice were trying to get the deal of the century on nukes out of North Korea. You know, John Kerry has done something very similar on inspections to what was done on human rights. You know, Chris Hill in six-party talks with North Korea said, "Oh, we're raising human rights in the context, but it'll be determined at some other time." That was bad enough. John Kerry did that with verification, which is kind of the most important thing in an arms control treaty, telling the IAEA basically, you know, we'll mention these in these secret side agreements, but you have to go and work this out yourself after we're done. The problem is that all of the leverage is off. And it's just one of many ways that this is just a poorly constructed agreement. Also, one other anecdote, throughout these agreements, there were times when the chief Iranian negotiator was screaming at the top of his lungs at the U.S. negotiator, most often Wendy Sherman. It's fine if you as a person are willing to take that kind of abuse, but you represent the United States of America. It's a terrible position from which to negotiate, and you should walk out.
Yeah, amen. Remind us, I think the listeners to this program have a pretty good recollection of this, but just remind us, Christian Whiton, of how that deal of the century, as they were calling it, actually worked out with respect to Iran's nuclear program.
Right. Well, and of course, the one with North Korea was very easy to measure, and it's been measured three times, specifically in 2006, in 2009, and 2013, with nuclear tests. It was two stages of appeasement. It was the Clinton-era agreed framework, where we gave North Korea a whole lot of money in the form of energy assistance, helped them start building reactors, technical assistance, which is also in this Iran deal. And, it's very interesting, too, because the agreed framework was an obvious failure. North Korea started cheating. They didn't do what they said they would do in the Clinton administration. But it took 2 years into the Bush administration to kill the agreed framework. And even then it was replaced with something that was also a failure, six-party talks, which led to a nuclear-armed North Korea. And it's very odd. You have Jeb Bush, for example, coming out and saying, well, if this deal survives through Congress, then, you can't say we're going to kill it on day one of a Republican administration. You have to wait till your team is in place, you have to have consultations and all this stuff. And it just brings to mind that Bush sort of diffidence, masquerading as noblesse oblige, and an unwillingness to take this on frontally.
Yeah, sort of maybe genetic in his DNA. I'm struck by that point, among other things, because it's usually wrapped up, and this sounds like vintage Brent Scowcroft to me, in being mature, as opposed to these hell-bent for leather young folks now campaigning for the presidential nomination for the Republican Party. And Christian Whiton, I guess, you've seen some of this, noblesse oblige or maturity at work in the last administration. Is that actually what's required? Not that maturity is a bad thing per se, but the cloaking of these kinds of, accommodations to bad guys that is really of a piece, if not quite as extreme, to that you're hearing out of John Kerry these days.
Right. Well, it would be, they would have more credit, of course, if their version of maturity worked, but it didn't. Jeb specifically, well, not by name, but everyone knew what he was doing, attacked Scott Walker, who said he'd begin to end this deal on day one of an administration. And think of that. You actually could do that. You could reverse, you could reinstate U.S. sanctions. You could signal that we want full compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran signed. You can say something in your inaugural address that's the opposite of what Obama said. Obama said, we will outstretch our hand if you unclench your fist. Iran hasn't actually unclenched its fist, but we certainly outstretched our hand.
And our wallet.
And that's exactly right. John Kerry, of course, this is par for course, and I think he loves every minute of this. He was up there. He loves to moralize. He loves to feign injury, and it's an interesting arc of his career. That it's a career that began before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, testifying, bad-mouthing his fellow American troops. He went to Vietnam 4 months, even though everyone else had to go for a year. He bought a camera crew somehow. And just
got a couple of Purple Hearts out of it.
Exactly, and lied about what U.S. troops were allegedly doing, and to come back now and deal this just grievous damage on our security and our Middle Eastern allies' security. It's full circle.
Well, it is full circle, and it seems to me it warrants impeachment of this man, his betrayals, particularly his personal history of them, but most especially this one is so egregious and likely to get a lot of us killed, I'm afraid, as we've been discussing with others in the course of the program. Christian Whiton is our guest with D.C. International Advisory. Let me just ask you, Christian, about another front on which you have been focused in this past week, because, among other things, President Obama has been traveling to Africa. Give us a sense of what he did there, and was it what needs to be done in that very strategic part of the world? Right.
Well, there's nothing wrong with visiting Kenya and Ethiopia, and those are the two East African nations where he visited, and those are two that are with us in fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia. But of course, it's Obama, so there's always something off a little bit. The news in Kenya, of course, is his mentioning of gay rights. It's fine if he wants to raise that. It's just very interesting what he chooses to engage on. So, gays have had as bad a time in Cuba as they have in Kenya, but of course that never gets mentioned. So it's not Obama re-engaging on human rights. It's Obama checking the box with a domestic left-wing constituency. And also he is unable, seemingly congenitally unable, to utter the words radical Islam. So again, we're fighting these violent extremists in Somalia. Well, there's a common thread that runs between al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda and ISIS, and frankly the Iranian regime that he just arranged a huge paycheck for, and that is Islamism. And it's this lingering inability of the Democrats and even some Republicans to concisely describe this threat and how we're going to confront it. And the problem is, of course, no one wants to spend a lot of time and resources in Africa, and the rich world has spent $1 trillion in development aid that really hasn't accomplished much. But security aid fighting al-Shabaab, it's unfortunately necessary. And if you look at what they are doing, they're moving more into Kenya. They blew up a hotel in Mogadishu. They've targeted Westerners in Kenya, and they have these linkages which seem to be growing with other groups like al-Qaeda and possibly ISIS.
Yeah, this is such an important point, and I appreciate, Christian Whiton, the clarity with which you address it. Islamic supremacism is, in fact, the connective tissue, this desire to impose Sharia on Christians and Muslims, for that matter, and everybody the world over, is animating both the Shiites of Iran and the Sunnis of all these other stripes, including, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood, as you know. It's enormously frustrating that the administration remains so indifferent to these points. It's not just that it's not talking about them or it's casting its eye elsewhere. It's really misleading the public, notably by promoting this notion that the real threat is something called violent extremism, which is brought to us by conservatives and Tea Party activists and veterans and the like. Christian, thank you for this very, very interesting conversation and for your great work at Fox and in your writings elsewhere. D.C. International Advisory, LLC is his base. Smart Power, Between Diplomacy and War is his book. Come back to us again very soon. I hope the rest of you will do so again tomorrow, same time, same station. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for listening.